An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today's video takes us to the Guard Psychic phase, which has gone from strength to strength over the last few weeks. First with Astro Path becoming hilariously cheap in chapter approved, and now the Greater Good giving us a fantastic new stratagem to get more of our powers on the table more reliably. I think that the Guard Psychic phase is very underestimated. It actually provides incredibly good utility because it's just so cheap for us to deploy. Most other factions can't muster a Psyker that can add +1 to saves, -1 to hit, and make a unit fearless for a turn, but with Astro Paths we can do all of that for just 45 points, which is frankly pretty crazy. In this video we'll talk about the various Psyker options and their positives and negatives, that tasty new stratagem from the Greater Good, and we'll go through each of these Psykana discipline psychic powers and talk about their positives and negatives. In the background, Psykers are employed by the Imperial Guard when certain rare individuals are identified who are able to control his prodigious and dangerous abilities without posing a danger to others. And Sanction Psyker's exact role will depend on the exact strength and nature of the powers he can manifest. They are indoctrinated by the Scholastica Psykana, the training division of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, where from there they may become Astropaths or Word Vein Psykers, and the most notable and powerful individuals among them become Primaris Psykers, also known as Battle Psykers, who are often attached under the command of a high-ranking Astra Militarum general to deploy on the field of war much like any other asset. Psykers are inherently mistrusted by the Imperial Guard, however, and should their dangerous abilities get out of control, a Commissar's bolt pistol often isn't far away, just in case they need to be brutally reined in a bit. Very arcane indeed, so let's have a think about their application on the table. So here are the different ways that we can get Guard Psychic powers on the table. I've already done quite an in-depth look at the Astro Path with Psychic Maelstrom, which is one of my favourite Imperial Guard units. We're not going to look too in-depth about each individual's datasheet in this video, we might save that for another one. We'll go for a bit more of a general overview this time. Firstly, and arguably in my opinion best, is the Astro Path. Astro Paths are now hilariously cheap at 15 points per model when you give them a las pistol instead of their Telepathica stave. To my knowledge, there are no races that have a cheaper way to cast a psychic power than an Astro Path, which is pretty good seeing as the Guard Psychic powers are actually pretty decent. I honestly think that they're one of the most undervalued units in all of 40k at the moment. An Astro Path knows one psychic power from the Psykana discipline. He can cast it on the full 2d6 as normal. The only limitation he has is with Smite, where he has to cast that on a 1d6. But still, that can often surprise you. If you do luck out and roll a 5 or a 6 for your first cast of Smite, he can still surprise the enemy with some mortal wounds. I'd say that these are the default choice, and in competitive guard lists it's very tempting to run 3 of these guys to get 3 very powerful buffs on the table for a measly investment of just 45 points. I would treat these as the default option. Next we have Primaris Psykers. These guys are 46 points and don't have any war gear options. They have some advantages over the Astro Path in that they know 2 psychic powers, but they can still only cast 1. So if you were doing a direct comparison between them and Astro Paths, for the price of 1 Primaris Psyker you could get 3 Astro Paths, who between them know 3 and cast 3, compared with the Primaris Psyker who knows 2 and can cast 1. The Primaris Psyker does have a couple of advantages. Firstly, he has access to full power Smite, which the Astro Paths don't have, so if you're looking to throw out some cheap mortal wounds, and you already have Psychic Maelstrom, then this guy's a good shout. He also fills an HQ choice, which the Astro Paths don't, although to be honest I would argue that if you're looking to fill HQ choices, you could still take an Astro Path and run a company commander alongside him for fewer points than the Primaris Psyker is. That way you filled your HQ choice, got the same amount of casts per turn, and also got all the advantages of a company commander with his orders as well. His other minor advantage is that he has a decent amount of close combat compared with the Astro Paths, but this is still guard close combat, don't be mistaken. Occasionally it might surprise you and knock off a Space Marine or something, but it really isn't ever going to achieve wonders. Before the Greater Good, I pretty much wouldn't use Primaris Psykers, or at least not until I have 3 Astro Paths on the table. But since that and the new stratagem that we'll get onto, there's certainly one solid argument for the Primaris Psyker. Finally, we have the Word Vein Psykers. These ones are 7 points per model and they come in a squad of 3 at base, meaning that you can get a cast for just 21 points. Now these guys are very cheap as well, but they do have 2 quite big downsides. First of all, they aren't characters, which means that the enemy can literally just shoot straight at them with any of their conventional war gear, and with the paltry guardsman defensive profile, if they can be seen and can be shot, they will die very quickly. The second major disadvantage is that they can only cast anything on a 1d6, not just smite, so they're really not very reliable for casting some of our key psychic powers. Now you can increase the casting chance by having more miniatures in the unit. If they have 3 or more models, they get +1 to cast, and if they have 6 or more, they get +2 to cast. But even if they do get this +2 on the best case scenario, they're still even failing to cast a Warp Charge 5 smite 1/3 of the time. Never mind other major psychic powers, some of them are just plain out of reach for these guys to cast with any sort of reliability. They might be perhaps a little bit more reliable if you're going for Mental Fortitude, which is only Warp Charge 4, but still it's far from guaranteed, and if they do cast, then it's very easily denied, as even if they roll a 6, the casting value is still going to be very low indeed. All of those combine to mean that Word Veins are pretty much never really played in competitive guard lists, but of course they do have the new Psychic Awakening strat, which might genuinely change that. Now this one is called Psychic Conclave. It's a 1 command point stratagem found in the Greater Good, and it's used when you have a Primaris Psyker and a unit of Word Vein Psykers right next to each other. This is a ludicrously powerful psychic stratagem, giving them both +2 to cast, and each one can cast 1 additional time. So if you wanted to pretty much guarantee that you're going to get off Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier on a key unit you want to defend, then the Primaris Psyker could potentially do both of those at +2 to cast, and then the Word Veins could have a go at doing something else as well. As say if there's just 3 models in the squad, then it'd be 1d6 +3 to cast everything, which would basically be an auto pass on Mental Fortitude if you wanted to buff the morale of a unit nearby, for example. Unfortunately, the Word Veins only know 1 power from the Psykana discipline, so if they did want to cast their second power, which they can with this stratagem, it would have to be Smite, so they would have to be somewhat close to the enemy. Now these guys do get gunned down pretty much instantly if they're exposed to enemy firepower, which would stop you using this stratagem in later turns, so it might honestly just be better to hide them out of line of sight at the back of the board next to some key tanks that you need to protect, and use them to reliably spam out the psychic buffs. Alternatively, if you did want to use them a little more aggressively, you could have both them and a Primaris Psyker casting a Smite on a +2, and also perhaps the Primaris Psyker throwing out Psychic Maelstrom casting on a 5. This would be a very decent mortal wound output indeed, around 5 mortal wounds on the closest target on average after casting, which isn't at all bad for 67 points and 1 command point. As I said though, they are very much likely to be a one-hit wonder. Once those Word Veins are exposed, they're going to get shot down very easily. Finally, I just thought I'd mention Iradium Magellan, the Primaris Psyker from Blackstone Fortress, who has 1 additional psychic power that's a bit different to the standard ones from the book. She costs 40 points, has basically the same stat line as the Primaris Psyker, and no smite, and is locked into her own unique Psychic Augment power. Psychic Augment is Warp Charge 8, and it gives +1 to hit for an infantry unit. Being just a nice stock +1 to hit is very good, but being limited to infantry is somewhat annoying, as it really does limit the potential targets of this spell. Warp Charge 8 is also very high indeed, so she's likely to fail it the majority of the time, unless you are combining it with some Word Vein Psykers to use that Psychic Conclave stratagem, which I believe that she can use, as she has the Primaris Psyker keyword. Something to bear in mind anyway. It might honestly be one of the most powerful things that you could use on a huge squad of conscripts, making them hit on 4+ again rather than their normal 5+, and you could potentially try and combine that with orders or other stratagems to get an awful lot of firepower out of the conscript blob. Could be good on veteran units or big combined infantry squads too. Now we get to the Psykana discipline itself, and to be honest it is quite a good discipline. I'd say all but 1 are pretty usable, particularly as Astro Paths are so cheap, so it really just depends on which ones you'd like to select from the discipline. First up we have Terrifying Visions, which is a leadership manipulation mechanic, and it is Warp Charge 7, so it isn't the most reliable cast ever. However, -2 to leadership is a certainly reasonable debuff. There are plenty of Imperial things that manipulate morale, and you could combine it with various other factors to try and make some enemies run away very easily. Usually I'm not the most sold on leadership manipulation mechanics, as they don't impact a whole bunch of armies, whether they have fearless rules, are made entirely of vehicles, or sometimes when it's the rare chance that it does have a big effect, your opponent can easily counter all your planning with that 2 command point auto pass morale stratagem from the main book. However, with cheap Astro Path, it's now a very cheap debuff to deploy. It could even be pretty potent in combination with some of our other leadership manipulation mechanics. There's a new tank ace that can give you -2 leadership when you hit them with some artillery, and there's the new Militarum Tempestus Scions, the Scion Jackals, who basically double the effect of morale when infantry are shot by them. Between these mechanics you could even have Space Marines automatically running away, so I think that this one does have more legs than it used to. Next up we have Gaze of the Emperor, in my opinion the only dud power from this discipline. Its warp charge 6, has a 2d6 inch range, and on a 4+, each unit along the line of that 2d6 inch suffers a mortal wound. Now 2d6 could be up to 12 inches, it could be as low as 2, so even if you cast it you might not get anything in range, and even if you do manage to skewer an enemy unit with it, it might not get a mortal wound because you have to roll a 4+. Ideally you'd be trying to skewer a whole bunch of enemy units along this line, but that means putting your Psyker in the middle of the enemy army, and even if you do achieve something spectacular like getting 4 units along the line, it's still on average only 2 mortal wounds damage output. Frankly, just ignore this one and use either Smite or Psychic Maelstrom, both of which are excellent. Next up we have Psychic Barrier, one of our key psychic powers that's warp charge 6 and gives +1 to the armor save of a unit within 12 inches of the Psyker. Many other armies would absolutely kill for a power like this. It's a flat buff that you can give to the most threatening unit in your army each turn to blunt the enemy's shooting. With 15-point Astro Paths, I'd argue that this is worth including in every single guard list that you run. It really is just that good. The best places to deploy it are the units your opponent's likely going to want to kill first. It's particularly good on super heavies and tank commanders to try and keep them a bit safer. People often run it with bullgryn, where it both improves their armor save and their invul save, making them a massive pain to shift on the table. But basically any guard unit that you think are going to be shot next turn are a legitimate target for this buff, even if you just use it on a lowly infantry squad in cover, and you stat go to ground on it as well, then you could have a guardsman squad saving on a 2+, and that's really going to make sure an objective is secured for a turn. Awesome power, really cheap to deploy, can't recommend it enough. Next up we have Night Shroud, which I can basically just say all the exact same things about Psychic Barrier for. -1 to hit is absolutely great, really powerful debuff to enemy shooting, although unlike Psychic Barrier this won't help you in close combat, so be aware of that. Again, be aiming to put this on the unit that's the most likely to be shot next turn, to make your opponent have to expend more firepower to get rid of that unit. This one's particularly powerful in combination with some things that give -1 to hit debuffs in the guard army. One example is smoke launchers on your tank commanders. If you issue Strike and Shroud to be able to shoot and then pop smoke, you could have your key tank commander being -2 to hit next turn, and this will really help keep him alive, maybe force your opponent to target on a less high priority threat. It's similarly good on flyers such as Valkyries or Vendettas, again making them a pain to target, but as with Psychic Barrier, most any unit will see decent durability benefits from this, and it synergizes very well with Psychic Barrier. If you put both on the same unit, then you are massively upping that unit's durability, as people love to do with their bullgryn squads at the moment. Again, at a 15-point Astro Path tax, I'd argue that this one is getting into auto-include territory for the guard right now. Next up we have Mental Fortitude, which is Warp Charge 4, and this one basically makes a unit fearless within 12 inches. Warp Charge 4 means it's a near guaranteed cast, and again it's a reasonable option for mitigating morale, particularly as it's so cheap for 15 points, meaning that it does decently compete with other leadership mechanics such as Commissars. The most obvious use for this one is to buff conscripts to make them fearless, meaning that you can properly leverage their 30-man squad size without one of the major downsides, which is poor morale. One downside to this is that it won't be applicable in the first turn if you happen to be going second, meaning that you do somewhat run the risk of your conscripts getting shot up and running away unless you auto-pass them before you get to deploy this buff, which is a downside to be fair. It's also very good combined with big combined infantry squads, when you spend the 1 command point to consolidate squads to get bigger squads for bigger buffs, and more efficient use of stratagems or psychic powers such as Psychic Barrier or Night Shroud. This can also help prevent that big combined squad from taking too many casualties from focus fire and morale. Overall, it's decent because it's so cheap again, the only major downside being the opportunity cost, where you might have wanted other options on this list. Finally, we have good old Psychic Maelstrom, which is one of the most efficient ways to generate mortal wounds in the entire game of 40k, because it gives you a targeted smite for Warp Charge 7 on a 15-point Psyker. As a lot of armies generally pay 40 to 50 points per cast of a psychic power, it's just ludicrously good value compared with all of their options when you can put it on a 15-point Astro Path again. I've already done an entire video focusing on an Astro Path with Psychic Maelstrom and how best to use him for the guard, so feel free to check that out if you're interested. The short version is though that this can target units out of line of sight, it can target characters even if they're not the closest, and it's just a great value way to strip some wounds off the opponent's army throughout the game. It's been an auto-include for me long before the Astro Paths went down in points cost, and it remains an auto-include for me now. Overall, my first choices for psychic powers in the Guard Codex are Maelstrom, Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier, the other two being a little bit niche, and Gaze of the Emperor not being worth taking at all. I think my first choice would still be to use the Astro Paths to cast the spells rather than the Primaris Psyker and Word Veins for that stratagem, though it does have its advantages, particularly if you're just looking to put Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier on a backfield unit, somewhere where the Word Veins can stay safe and help out the casting without just getting shot dead. This approach will get those powers off very reliably, but it will cost you more points and also a precious command point every turn, and the strategy gets nuked if someone kills the Word Veins maybe with some mortars or a Thunderfire cannon or something, so it does have its trade-offs. Overall though, the Guard Psychic phase is very decent. It's only going to be there to augment your army, but it's incredibly efficient on a points invested for value gained buff to your army. Let me know if there's any important strategies or ideas that I've missed for the psychic powers in the Guard decks. At some point we might have to talk about how Inquisitors apply to the Guard, as they certainly give us some interesting new options, though they definitely are a bit more pricier than these guys, and they're lovely cheap casting and denying powers. If you'd like to see more Guard content like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have new videos coming out every day, with plenty of them being for the Astra Militarum. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page. Any donations are much appreciated, as of course these videos take quite a while to make. The link is in the description below, and of course a big thank you to all my current Patreons for supporting the channel. I've got one of my own recent tournament reports coming out on the Patreon page, as well as a few other bonuses such as regular prize draws, and voting on the next videos to be seen on the channel. So if any of that interests you and you'd like to support, then feel free to check it out in the link down below. Thanks very much for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.